Election Commission in protest at Viktor Yanukovych's win, which they claim was rigged.
England's cricketers are staying in South Africa on the streets, but we're hearing from Ukraine's Yushchenko saying he doesn't recognise the election of the Prime Minister as officially declared, the event that happened earlier on this afternoon. Yushchenko, of course, the opposition leader, this man here.
And he went on to say that the declaration of the Prime Minister Yanukovych's winner puts Ukraine on the brink of civil conflict.
But they're still rallying their forces, if you like, in Kiev. They've had musicians playing almost round the clock to keep the tens of thousands of people who've come to Kiev entertained, to keep the pressure on the Prime Minister, who was officially declared this afternoon, despite the fact that the Americans, in the form of the Secretary of State Colin Powell, has said we cannot accept this result as legitimate because it doesn't meet international standards and because there's not been an investigation of the numerous and credible reports of fraud and abuse. The words of Colin Powell a short time ago.
So this is really increasing in tension tonight as not only words fly backwards and forwards between the two leaders, the man who has been officially named as the Prime Minister and the man who would be leader of Ukraine, the man there standing on the platform, this man, Viktor Yushchenko, who's still speaking to those thousands of protesters who've been out on Independence Square now for 3 days. And we hearing those quotes from Mr. Yushchenko earlier on. He accused the Prime Minister of a coup d'etat by rigging the elections. It's a crime against the people and the officials' actions should be examined under the penal code. Well, let's talk to Dmitry Zots, a Yushchenko supporter, joining us now live from the Ukrainian capital. Very good evening to you. Can you hear me, Dmitry Zots?
Yeah.
Good. Tell us what the latest feeling is amongst the Yushchenko supporters. Do you still have confidence that you can change this election result?
Well, actually, I cannot consider myself as a Yushchenko supporter. I am here for freedom and justice because this election has been rigged. And my right as a citizen been violated, as many other people. I've never been involved politically in my life, but this time, on this square, I'm among the people. Not just because of Yushchenko, because of justice and freedom. And if you're asking me about hope, there is a lot of hope. Look at the people's eyes, they're glowing, and I'm sure they will win.
And can they win peacefully and lawfully?
I can hear you, sorry.
Dmitry, can the people you are with, can they win this lawfully and peacefully?
Yeah, people are ready for a peaceful solution. And what I can see here, it's people who just, you know, they're not aggressive at all. What they want is just vote to be counted and acknowledged. That's all. And they're very peaceful. They're very happy because first time in our nation's history we feel us as a united nation.
Dmitry, tell us why you are all so concerned about this election. What do you think was unfair?
Sorry, can you say it again?
What evidence do you have that this election was rigged?
Okay, it's very simple. In the area which never been historical turnout more than 70%, they got 96% turnout and 98% people voting in favor of another candidate. From the same areas, we got 500,000 distance voting ballots, which means that they happily voted 108% of population. And you can consider by yourself, is it physically possible or not?
Dmitry, Mr. Yushchenko, we understand on the platform behind you, is calling for a political strike throughout the whole of Ukraine. Do you think people will rise up?
Well, unfortunately, because I'm live on TV now, I can't hear what Yushchenko is saying. But you know, what I'm absolutely sure, people will stand their position and will make their voice heard. I don't know about all these political technologies or strikes, but I'm absolutely sure people will stand and make their voice heard. We are for justice, we are for freedom.
I'll bring in Taras Shaban, who is an official observer for the Ukrainian opposition during the elections. He's here in our central London studios. Taras Shaban, thanks for joining us. Just tell us a little bit more about what Dmitry Zots was talking about. What did you see in this election that has you so concerned about the legality of the result?
Yes, well, exactly the things that Dmitry mentioned, like the voters' turnout higher than 96% in Donetsk region. Every third polling station in Donetsk had 100% or more turnout. Now, we haven't had this since the days of the USSR. People just don't come, 100% of people. Then, also, on a lot of these polling stations, members of election commissions were just thrown out. Official observers were thrown out by thugs and sometimes even by the police. And, well, it's impossible to say if these elections were fair or not. And I suspect they weren't if the voter turnout was 100% and 98% voted for Mr. Yanukovych.
Does there appear to be a pattern in what you believe is fraud? Was it regional? Did it divide the country in a way into regions where there appeared to be more fraud than other regions?
As you know, Mr. Yanukovych comes from Donetsk region, and that region is very much under control of him and his colleagues, his allies. Therefore, he can bribe a lot of individuals there, and well, he can frighten them. So use scare tactics, and that's where most of the fraud came from, sort of south and east of Ukraine.
And of course, he's a Russian speaker rather than a Ukrainian speaker. That suggests more polarizing, more divisions within the country.
Well, he speaks Ukrainian as well. He claims he learned it very quickly. So. He speaks both languages, just like I do.
Right. But do you sense, though, that this is going to be very divisive, that even if Mr. Yushchenko did eventually assume power, that he would find it then difficult to have any control over those eastern regions like Donetsk?
The problem of eastern regions is not the problem of people who live there. They are unfortunate souls that don't have enough information about what is going on in the country. The freedom of press is just not present there, and there is just government-controlled channels on TV, radio, government-controlled papers. So they are unfortunate in that sense. The problem is not of the people who live there. The problem is of a number of families, just maybe a few thousand people across Ukraine, who are oligarchs basically, and who want to keep the power at any cost.
Well, let's just get a view again from Dmitry Zots, who we can see live in Independence Square in Kiev. Dmitry, we're coming back to you. Do you sense that this is a historic moment for the Ukraine and the people of the Ukraine?
This is an absolutely crucial moment in our history. I never seen this city like this before. I never seen this country like this in my life. And this is a moment of truth. And I just hope next day or day after that we'll have fair results of election and we'll move forward towards Europe.
Do you sense that the only way that this may be sorted out is to have another election that is more carefully monitored? Dmitry, do you think you may have to have a second election? I think Dmitry Zot's having difficulty. Let me bring in Taras Shaban, who was an official observer for this, for the opposition during these elections. Do you sense that that may be the only way forward to replay this election, Taras?
I mean, the first solution would be just to be very open and fair about the process of counting. It's just not acceptable for the Central Electoral Commission just to come out and say we counted 100% of votes and this is the result. They can't ignore, the reports from OSCE, from European Union. They can't ignore the report by U.S. Senator Lugar, who said this was an organized campaign to make this election fraudulent. They have to explain themselves before we make any decisions about any other elections. I think, this election, we can still count votes fairly in this one. Mr. Yushchenko told today that to his supporters that he's prepared to have another round of votes, but really, to start with, we need to find out what was the fair count for this election that just happened.
You mentioned the Americans there, and in the last hour, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell has spoken and on behalf of the Bush administration said that the United States doesn't accept the result, and they've suggested that there would be consequences for the relationship with Ukraine unless the two sides get together and find some sort of solution. Is it important what America thinks about this?
Of course it's important. Of course these people will think about what the administration in the White House says. I think it is also important for the government of this country, for Jack Straw and perhaps Prime Minister, to say what they think. It is very important. These people do listen to it, and it is very important for the people who are on the square there to hear that the world is with them. They are not on their own.
Taras Shaban, one of the official observers at the election last Sunday, thank you very much for joining us as we continue looking at these live pictures of what is people power being demonstrated for a third consecutive day in Independence Square in the heart of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev.
Yes, an ally of the newly declared Prime Minister has not ruled out a new election, a second election. The opposition leader, though, has declared a general strike. He's calling for schools, hospitals, transport systems to be closed to make the opposition party have its say in this election.
Well, the other big story tonight.
Hundreds even camped overnight in the centre of Kiev despite the freezing temperatures, and they vowed to stay on until their demands are met. The result links with Russia. Most of his support is in the east of the country, which is heavily industrialized and has large numbers of Russian speakers. His rival, the opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko, wants closer links with the west. His support is mainly in the west of Ukraine, a largely agricultural area, which is devoutly Catholic.
Many spent a freezing night camped out here. They're refusing to go home until the election result is overturned. It's the fourth day they've taken to the streets. They say their candidate, the pro-West Viktor Yushchenko, should have won the election. They've been cheated. Ukraine's opposition is calling for a general strike to try to paralyse the country. As the Russian President Vladimir Putin meets European Union leaders at a summit in The Hague, there are echoes of the Cold War. Putin backed the nominal winner, Viktor Yanukovych, before the poll. The US and the European Union won't recognise the official outcome.
As far as we could see, OSCE EU monitors could see these elections have been flawed. So we'll continue to take a very close interest indeed in the process. And we will certainly not accept this as a final result, at least until all the legal processes and challenges are through.
The crisis will dominate the summit. As it started, the Kremlin released details of Mr. Putin's message of congratulations to Mr. Yanukovych. Our countries, linked by similar historical and cultural ties, are becoming even closer, he says. This is Viktor Yushchenko, the opposition leader the demonstrators say should be their president. They've been to the Ukraine Supreme Court today to begin the process of trying to get the election result overturned. But this man is officially in charge. He's backed by Moscow and much of the east of the country. In a bid to calm everyone down, the former Polish president, Lech Wałęsa, has been addressing the crowds in Kiev. People power hasn't won so far, nor has pressure from the West. After 4 days, everything still hangs in the balance. Lisa Hamperley, BBC News.
Now we're going to cross live now to Ramallah. The Foreign Secretary Jack Straw.
EU, it's Ray versus Bobby.
Clear winner in the Ukrainian elections. After 4 days of protests, events are beginning to gather pace. Liberal opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko, the man officials say lost the election, but whose supporters think probably won, has already called for a general strike. Now there are reports his supporters could start surrounding government buildings in protest. Meanwhile, America and Russia seem to be taking sides in the row. Here's what's going on in the capital, Kiev, tonight. Thousands of people have been there for 4 days now in the freezing cold. They've been entertained by an assortment of Ukrainian singers, as well as today the former Polish president Lech Wałęsa. That's not him. Opposition supporters are easily spotted with their orange party colours. Supporters of Viktor Yanukovych, who officially won the vote, are the ones waving pale blue banners.
Let's go back to the two victors now, and we'll deal with Viktor the loser in a moment. But first, let's take a closer look at the man many Ukrainians are calling Viktor the cheat. This is Ukrainian Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. He's already been declared the winner by Ukraine's election commission, but most international observers think the vote was rigged. Not that Viktor gives the stuff. He's got the backing of the former president, voters in the east, and the state-funded media. Crucially, though, Viktor is on great terms with his neighbours. Russia's President Putin was the first world leader to phone and congratulate Yanukovych on his win, a win that, if confirmed, will guarantee continued Russian rather than Western influence on Ukraine. That's the big stuff. Here's some of the small stuff. This Viktor has spent time in jail, has a PhD, and once allegedly told journalists the best instrument to deal with corruption is a red-hot poker. So that's the man some of Ukraine think has won, but what about Viktor number 2? Eddie?
Well, 1 down, 1 to go. Despite the questionable skincare regime, this Viktor Yushchenko, is Ukraine's most popular politician. The leader of the opposition, Viktor wants radical change and has the support of much of the western and central areas of Ukraine. If he becomes president, it's thought Ukraine would start getting pally with the West rather than Russia. Worried about losing one of their friends to America, Moscow has allegedly been in spin overdrive, portraying Yushchenko as an agent of the West who'd lead Ukraine into civil war. There's also talk of nastier goings-on. Look at these pictures. This is Viktor before, this is after. Viktor's allies say he was poisoned. The other side say his skin complaint is nothing more than the result of a bad clam. Confused? Lindley Gooden has more.
Ukraine covers a huge area, more than twice the size of the UK, sandwiched between Europe and Russia. 13 years after winning independence, Ukraine's still one of Russia's most important neighbours, pumping oil and 90% of their natural gas across the country to Europe through a network of pipelines.
All issues concerning the election situation in Ukraine.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin's already congratulated the Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, but refused to get involved any further.
Russian oil and gas exports make up something like 50% of the economy. And in recent years, because of the high oil and gas prices, Russia's benefited significantly in terms of the extra income.
Russia's not the only country that's shown an interest. Viktor Yushchenko, who complained of government corruption long before the elections, is seen to be pro-West. He was backed by Britain and America, as well as the supporters who spent the last 4 days protesting in the snow.
As far as we could see, these elections have been flawed. So we'll continue to take a very close interest indeed in the process, and we will certainly not accept this as a final result.
The two victors' policies aren't actually that far apart. Both need to keep Russia happy by pumping their gas, and Western Europe also buys a lot of it. But there are fears that the protests could collapse into violence. Some believe that'll depend on who controls the Ukrainian armies.
We don't know where the security services stand. Certainly, as far as we can tell up to now, they haven't decided that Yushchenko could be the winner or supported in any sort of tangible way. They're sitting back and holding back.
The Ukrainian Supreme Court has now promised an investigation into the challenger Yushchenko's claims that the vote was rigged. It doesn't look like the protesters are ready to go home yet. Lindley Gooden, BBC News.
Well, with us is Taras Chaban, official observer for the opposition, who earlier today delivered a petition to Downing Street, and Lucas Mistelis from the School of International Arbitration at Queen Mary School of Law. Taras, can I ask you first of all, why are you petitioning Downing Street? Why should the UK interfere in an election in Ukraine?
Well, for the people who are there on the squares of Kiev and other cities across Ukraine, not just west, it's also central and eastern Ukraine, it is very important to feel that they are not on their own, and it is very important to feel that they have support of the governments across Europe, Britain included, and also the United States and Canada.
But Russia's President Putin was making the point today that countries should stay out of an internal affair, let the legal process in Ukraine sort this out. There's a danger that the involvement of Europe, for example, could inflame the situation.
Well, the position of President Putin is really laughable if it wasn't so serious. First, he declared that he congratulated Mr. Yanukovych on his win. Then on Tuesday he took it back. Then the result was announced yesterday by the Central Election Commission, and President Putin said he congratulated Mr. Yanukovych. Now, the Supreme Court, the highest court in Ukraine, today said these results do not stand. We have to look into them. So is he going to take a step back again? I don't know, what is he doing? So for him to say that the West is taking too much interest, well, I think it's a bit too much, because he actually congratulates winners. And the West, the United States and Britain, all they say, they don't mention surnames, they don't take one side or the other. They say we want fair elections. That's what people of Ukraine want.
Right, Lucas, what role does the Supreme Court have in sorting out this election? Is there any similarities between this and the United States in 2000 when the Supreme Court decided who won?
Well, I mean, that's part of the risk here. The question is whether the Supreme Court will ultimately declare a winner and speak for the people. I think the mandate of the Supreme Court at the moment is to see whether the concerns that a lot of people have in Ukraine and outside Ukraine, that the result of the election was not the real expression of the will of the people. That will examine, for instance, various of the 100 complaints about fraud in the electoral process across the country. And what they can do is then they will say that the results do not stand. I think the real option would be for a rerun of the election rather than anything else.
But I wonder whether people would buy that. We will get the view of the opposition. But if people felt the original election was flawed and there was a huge media bias in favour of the pro-Russian candidate, what would be the point of another election?
Well, I think that is really in my view, the mistake that the opposition has made in the last 2 or 3 days. They have played all the cards too fast. So if the Supreme Court were to say on Monday or Tuesday that the result stands, then there's nothing for the opposition to do legally, unless we move to a political solution, which could be quite controversial.
Taras, are you worried your hand has been played too quickly?
Well, I'm not a spokesman for the opposition.
No, indeed.
I'm an official observer for them, so I can't say, what cards are they playing. Well,
what happens if the Supreme Court comes back and says this election stands?
Well, it's not about somebody saying this result does not stand or this result stands.
Well, yes, it does. That's what the Supreme Court does.
Yeah, it's about explaining to people why is this, what is this result? The Central Election Commission just came out and said we counted these 100% of votes, and there you go. These are the results. That's not good enough. They have to address the concerns that people have, and not just people on the street, but also the international observers, the OSCE.
All right. Well, I suppose my question then should be, if the Supreme Court comes out and does say this election result stands, what do you think the opposition will do then?
Well, they'll have to explore other avenues. There are international courts, for instance, and at the end of the day, according to the constitution of Ukraine, it's the people of Ukraine that are the bearers of the ultimate power in Ukraine.
All right, thank you.
Not the Supreme Court.
Thank you both for joining us. Nice to see you. We'll be back with that story, of course, when the Supreme Court makes its decision.